Iowa State has had one of the roughest off seasons of all time, losing their head coach and almost the entire roster. But did this all happen at the exact perfect time?
You are Locked On Cyclones, your daily podcast on the Iowa State Cyclones, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Cyclones, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now the number one sports podcast network, thanks to you. I am your host, Nick Marovets. Thank you for making this your first watch or listen of the day. I appreciate it more than you know. Be sure to hit subscribe down below so we can prove once and for all that it is, in fact, a Cyclone state. As today, we are back on the transfer portal. We're going to start with the ridiculous amount of players that are in the portal from across all of college football and talk a little bit about how, yes, it's been a tragic offseason so far, but it's actually kind of been a blessing in disguise, the way the college football landscape has worked out. Then in the second segment, we're going to talk a little bit about the new additions to the Iowa State roster for next season, who they are and what the roster looks like as a whole, and one tiny detail in particular that I really want to dive into, so stick around for that. And then to round out today's show, Christian Rauh and I break down some Farmageddon Friday stuff. Is Rocco Becht the next Will Howard? Can't wait to get into all of that. Obviously, an electric ending to the week. But first, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The college football playoff is here, and FanDuel is the best place to get into the action all playoff long. So visit FanDuel.com to get your college football playoff profit boosts every game day. It's no secret that Iowa State has been, you could say, on the short end of the stick this entire offseason. Over 50 players in the portal, Matt Campbell gone, all of his assistant coaches. We all know that the season next year is going to look very different than it did this last year. But the question that I've kind of been thinking about a little bit is, maybe this happened at the exact perfect time, like the exact right year. I saw a tweet come out that over 10,000 players are in the college football transfer portal. Think about that for a second. 10,000 players. I can't even count to 100, let alone 10,000. So the fact that Iowa State lost their entire roster in the year that over 10,000 players are available, to me, feels like, okay, well, we got our pick of the litter then. We got some options out here. We don't have to pick between 15 guys or basically just pull over the entire Washington State roster. Obviously, with Jimmy Rogers coming over from Washington State, we get a ton of options. And the reason I say this could be the perfect year is who knows what kind of limitations will be put on the transfer portal in years to come, right? Obviously, over the last few years, it's kind of been leading up until this point. So hypothetically speaking, if Iowa State were to have lost Matt Campbell last year or the year prior, or back when Brock Purdy, we talked about with Matt Campbell going out to USC, what was going on there. If this had happened in the past, before this year, I think there's a chance that Iowa State wouldn't have had as many players to pick from, right? The portal was much different. NIL was much different. Everything has kind of led up until this point. So then the argument is, well, maybe if Iowa State had, gotten an extra year or two, would they be in an even better spot? Well, I would argue that right now the transfer portal is in such a chaotic spot. The transfer portal is, we have over 10,000 players in there. NIL is out of control. Guys are signing contracts and then backing out of the contracts and committing to the portal and then committing back to the school that they were just at. Guys are unenrolling and re-enrolling in new schools to avoid the transfer portal rules. Everyone's being sued. It's chaos, okay? In the next 2, 3, 4 years, I think there's a real possibility, a real chance that we start to get some, maybe not legislation, but certainly some sort of rules, some sort of outlines of some sort to prevent it from getting so out of control. Maybe it looks something like every player gets one transfer before they have to sit out a year. I don't know. Maybe it's related to coaches and whether or not a team has a coach. I don't know what the rules are going to be because, to be honest, I didn't see it getting to this point. But I have a hard time imagining that we continue down the path we're on because we all know it's not going to stay how it is now. We didn't reach this point and now we're just right in here. No, we have to assume that it's going to go into another direction. So it'll either continue trajectory or it'll come back down to the earth. And I think there's a real world where this was kind of the peak of the transfer portal. I think Jimmy Rogers, obviously Matt Campbell saw this a little bit as well, but because of Matt Campbell's departure, Jimmy Rogers stepped in and now has his pick of the litter as far as obviously we've talked about the struggle in the money department for Iowa State and what does the future look like. Jamie Pollard's talked about the debt that Iowa State's going to be in, NIL versus, rev share. How does that whole thing work? I know that it's not ideal in that department, but you have 10,000 players to choose from. And when there's 10,000 players to choose from, not only does Iowa State get to pick from that pool, but every single school gets to pick from that pool. Meaning that the top of the 1% is no longer 5 players. The 1% is 500 players or 1,000 players or whatever it is. And then as Indiana picks their guys and fills their holes, there's not just like 50 guys left. There's a like 900 guys left, and every other team and school gets to pick from the top. And Iowa State either gets a few of those top guys, which I think that they have so far, is a few guys that I'm extremely excited about. But it also means that they get some of those tier 2, tier 3 guys that they might not have gotten before, or those guys at the FCS level. Now everybody's jumping into the portal. It's completely normal. Some high-level talent gets by the big schools because they're picking up the top stuff, those studs. In particular, guys like X-Line are going to be huge pickups, I think, for Iowa State for next season. They would have probably gotten picked up by a bigger school had there not been 10,000 players in the portal. So this is just a general conceptual conversation. I do think that Iowa State got relatively lucky in the timing on this whole thing, because I think this was the best year to lose basically your entire roster. And I know maybe that might be a situation where I'm just trying to find the silver lining. Maybe I'm just looking at the amount of talent that's outgoing versus incoming and trying to come up with some sort of reasoning to be excited for next season. Although I don't think that's the case. I just will clarify, I am very pumped about the transfer portal, kind of roster list, if you will, that Jimmy Rogers has put together. But I just think there is something to be said here. I think that there is something to be understood where if Iowa State, goes through this again, if Jimmy Rogers leaves in 5 years, I do think it'll be tougher for this team to rebuild. And that's something we've talked about quite a bit on here, is how long does Jimmy Rogers end up sticking around? And there's quite a few opinions on that, to be honest. Some that think he'll stick around for a long time, and some that think he's going to do to us what he did to Washington State. Regardless, that will be in the future, when I do think the transfer portal will shift yet again. And so I think that there's something to be optimistic about here. Even if it isn't the team that you're excited for next season, at least look at it as we're able to field a full team, right? We were able to bring in basically guys from any school as opposed to guys only from schools that had lost their coach. Because if it was under the rule where you could only transfer and play the next year if your coach had left, well, you're only getting guys from schools that lost their coach. That's really how this would work. That would narrow the pool down to, a tiny fraction of what it is now. And then all of the other schools are going to be picking up those kinds of players. Granted, it would obviously be smaller because less guys are transferring out. So the whole situation shifts, but it's at least worth keeping in mind here that Iowa State, I think, got kind of a lucky break here, if you will. Obviously, not everything is positive. I completely understand that. But let's just think about the fact that 10,000 players, I mean, obviously, Iowa State can't pick from literally every single one, but they can at least contact every single one. They can shoot their shot, if you will. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. I feel like Jimmy Rogers is doing a great job, though. And we have to talk about some of the new additions that are coming to Iowa State's roster next season, coming up right here after this. But first, a word from our friends over at Rauh Ready. Let's talk about something that most men don't bring up, but absolutely should. Stress from work, money, life. It doesn't just switch off at night. And when it shows up at the worst possible time, Rauh Ready is designed to help you take back control. Rauh Ready is a next-generation prescription treatment created to support both the brain and the body so you can feel present, confident, and ready when the moment matters. You connect with a board-certified doctor online, and everything ships discreetly to your door. It's easy to understand why over 150,000 men have already made the switch, and most men are ready in about 15 minutes on average. So you can stay present, confident, and in control when the moment is right. If you've been thinking about taking the next step, now is the time. Head to raugiet.com/lockedoncollege. That's RUGIET.com/lockedoncollege to get 15% off your order for a limited time. Rauh Ready. Feel present, feel confident, feel ready. Iowa State is putting together a portal class for the ages, and Jimmy Rogers is at the head of the whole situation. I can't wait to talk about a few extra names that Iowa State will be bringing in for next season. But first, I just want to thank you for making Locked On Cyclones your first watch or listen every single day, and making Locked On Podcast Network the #1 sports podcast network out there. We couldn't do it without every single one of you guys. And to kind of celebrate that, I want to let you guys know about something we're doing. The new Everydayer Club gets you access to the ad-free audio feed for Locked On Cyclones wherever you listen to your podcast. Great for when you're in the car. You can't necessarily throw on the video. I think it's perfect for that situation. It also gets you access to members-only Locked On Everydayer Club Discord server. I do have the link in the description below or in the show notes if you're listening. Shout out to you. But if you have your pen and paper, the link is lockedoncyclones.supercast.com to go and learn more. Thank you guys so much for making this your first watch or listen. You guys, like I said, can't do it without you. Let's talk about this portal class that Jimmy Rogers keeps throwing together. I've got 3 more names I want to cover here with you. A defensive lineman, Bryson Lamb, will be coming over to Iowa State from Washington State as a redshirt junior. He started 12 games. And had 3.5 tackles for loss and 1.5 sacks. He'll spend his final season in Ames. Malachi Tace, a defensive end. We're starting to get some defensive players all up in here. Another Washington State player. He's 6'2", 265. Had a few tackles behind the line, forced a fumble last season. And then lastly, defensive lineman Jack Janikowski, awesome last name, is also from Washington State, will be playing for Iowa State next season with 2 years of eligibility. He's at 6'2", 242, and didn't have quite the same stats, but a couple tackles for loss and a sack there as well. I like that we're loading up on the defensive line, that we're loading up on the defensive side of the ball. I have talked about how important I think it is that Iowa State gets after the quarterback moving forward. Wasn't really a point of emphasis in the past. I think this is something that Iowa State can, if you're going to make a big jump anywhere, I understand the entire roster is different, but if you were to hypothetically let's just put last year's roster exactly where it is now, say that they all didn't transfer. If there was one thing I wanted to see more of last season, it would have been pressure on the quarterback. It would have been, pressuring throws, hurrying throws, happy feet in the pocket, those kinds of things, at least imposing will early to remind the quarterback, like, hey, you're not really safe back there. It wasn't something Iowa State put a lot of emphasis on. And so I do appreciate the fact that we're starting to see a few guys on the defensive end, defensive line kind of positioning here. And there's a clear, I wouldn't say point of emphasis quite to the same extent as the offensive line. I think we can all agree. We've had the questions like, who's going to be running the ball? Like, are we just going to be handing it off to offensive linemen? I've seen those comments. Those are electric and very valid. But we are starting to see the everything come to fruition as far as Jimmy Rogers saying, we're going to win in the trenches. We're going to win with the offensive line, win with the defensive line. And just me personally, I am completely fine with that. Like, that, of all of the ways to win games, all of the ways to kind of take over, there is something so special about just dominating with the big men up front, right? Dominating the line of scrimmage, either moving it forward during a run play or pushing an entire offensive line back with your defensive linemen. When you win the line of scrimmage, when you dominate the line of scrimmage, it makes all of the other positions on the field work a little bit less, therefore essentially making their jobs easier. So if you really want to kind of think about it, if you're able to dominate the offensive line, dominate the defensive line, you don't need quite as much talent. You don't need, obviously Iowa State still has, but you don't need as much talent at the linebacker, safety, cornerback position. I would say even running back. If you're behind a great offensive line, I don't think it's any secret that you don't need to be an A-plus top tier, can't miss it talent. And there's always the conversation of, if a running back is having a phenomenal season, is it the running back or is it the offensive line? Generally, you dive into tape, you see what kind of the holes the running back is working with. If he's walking down a Walmart aisle, it's probably the offensive line. If he's dodging guys left and right, then yeah, of course the running back is talented. In every situation, the running back is talented. I'm not downplaying the running back play here. But if Jimmy Rogers is able to build something up front, like the way that it's kind of coming together here, I think Iowa State is going to have a very good base for next season, which is exactly what Jimmy Rogers has been tasked with. He has to develop a base this next season because there is no base. There's nothing left after what Matt Campbell basically took with him or encouraged. I don't know if I should say encouraged, but his departure encouraged everyone else to leave, right? So we got to take it 1 year at a time. And if you had to pick one thing for Jimmy Rogers to kind of set as home base and to move forward with, this would be, I feel like, my pick. I'm curious what yours would be. Let me know in the comments below, or you can tweet at me at Nick_Marv. I did notice, though, of these 3 guys that are going to be joining Iowa State next season, I don't know if you caught this, but all 3 are from Washington State. So I decided to go through on 24/7 Sports and just go, player by player, how many of them are coming from Washington State. If you go to Washington or to the transfer portal, the top 6 are all from Washington State, the most recent guys. I counted 13 of the 32 players that Iowa State is bringing in the portal are from Washington State from last season. And is that a concern? Is that almost too much, either from one team or from, the Pac-2 level? Like, I could see that being an argument as well. It's not like we're bringing in players from, hypothetically any Big Ten school like Indiana or, even an ACC school. Like, this is Washington State we're working with here. And here's what I have to say on that point. I think this is actually a totally valid move because, like I've been talking about, Jimmy Rogers needs to succeed early, and having a bunch of players that know how to play with each other early on is going to be very helpful. Now, of course, you need talent from across the board, and that's what I just talked about with the 10,000 players in the portal. That's the bright side of a portal that size, of a pool that size, if you will. You get to choose. But if Jimmy Rogers needs to win right now, next season, which I think he kind of does a little bit, I think, Cyclone fans like you and I are going to be completely fine if he ends up with, I wouldn't say 3 wins, maybe 4 to 5 wins. If he doesn't quite make that bowl game, I don't think I'm going to be too worried. But the future of Iowa State athletics, then, I think, is in trouble as far as trajectory goes. And to achieve that bowl season that I think Jimmy Rogers kind of has to achieve, you're probably going to need some roster continuity to an extent. And how do you do that as a new head coach? Well, you bring a bunch of guys from your last team. So I don't hate that. I actually think that could be a positive here. I also think it's worth noting that Jimmy Rogers brought in a ton of new guys at Washington State, something we really haven't talked about a whole lot. 75 new guys, I think, was the number, and still made a bowl game there. So absolutely has done this before. I trust his process. A couple of these guys, not every single one of them, but a couple of these guys coming from Washington State have been with, and this maybe, I guess, is a little bit of a concern, but have been with Jimmy Rogers since his South Dakota State days, and they're familiar with their head coach. So that's a positive and a negative. I can see all the comments like, does Iowa State really think they can compete with a South Dakota State roster? Well, I mean, we could ask the same question about Penn State. Can Penn State in the Big Ten handle it with a Big 12 roster? Valid, I suppose. I think they're still going to be just fine, as we talked about last week. Or maybe it was earlier this week, whenever it was. I think for the roster continuity, you're also tapping into player to coach relationship, which obviously Matt Campbell talked about with the quarterback position. For Jimmy Rogers, all of these guys that have been with him for a while, you can set the culture earlier. You can set the standard earlier. You don't have to win over as much of the locker room. You've got, if you will, like inside agents from the inside out that are going to help you develop. This is what the team's about. And of course, some of those guys from Iowa State, like, they know that stuff, right? Like, that's just how football works to an extent. And I think Iowa State's really done a very, very good job, Matt Campbell, over the last few years, bringing in the right guys. But the match to Jimmy Rogers, it's not always going to be 1-to-1. I don't know exactly what it looks like yet, as far as like what a Matt Campbell type of player looked like versus a Jimmy Rogers type of player. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet. And so I'm okay with kind of leaning on the fact that some of those guys that followed him from South Dakota State to Washington State, now to Iowa State, know what the expectation is, and they know exactly what Jimmy Rogers is about. And then you can work from the inside out there, and you don't have to convince literally everyone, because winning over a locker room, winning games is tough, but winning over a locker room might be one of the most challenging feats in all of college sports, in any sport, really. Football, basketball, wrestling, I imagine, would be a really tough one as well. So I think that there is some, there's positives and negatives to bringing over a bunch of Washington State players, but I'm choosing to look at the fact that roster continuity is there, familiarity with the coach is there. Washington State was relatively successful last season, obviously making a bowl game after where they'd been in the past and with a brand new head coach. There is a lot of excitement here with this transfer portal class, regardless of where they're from. Some might be concerned that they're all coming from a Pac-2 team. I don't think I'm in that boat. I'm relatively excited, honestly. But next, we need to dive into kind of the conversation. What happens if Rocco Becht has a ton of success out at Penn State? Or, how does Rocco Becht compare to Will Howard? A valid kind of conversion, definitely comparison, if you will. And Christian Rauh and I are going to break that down coming up right here after this. But first, a word from our friends over at FanDuel. The college football playoff is here, and FanDuel is giving all customers even more ways to get in on the action every single game day of the playoffs. Because right now, every college football playoff game day, FanDuel users get a profit boost waiting for them in the app. Here's what I love about it, personally, myself. You get to use the profit boost on the bets you already feel good about. So you can ride with a favorite that you think a team controls a matchup, or you can take a shot at the underdog if you can feel an upset coming. Looking at that Indiana-Oregon game, depends on how you feel. Or potentially, you could build a parlay around the players and moments that you think are going to decide the game. Then you just apply the profit boost and go for even bigger winnings. And when you win, FanDuel pays out instantly, which is perfect for playoff football. FanDuel is the best place to get into the action all playoff long. So visit FanDuel.com to get your college football playoff profit boosts every game day.
Hey, welcome on back, and we're going to end this one with a Farmageddon Friday. Locked on Kansas State, locked on Cyclones. Fun way to end your week here, and it's been a wild week with the transfer portal, things like that. I want to kind of take it back here because there's some things that happened, obviously, over the last couple of weeks, mostly with Iowa State, that have happened with a lot of players leaving the transfer portal. It's also happened with Kansas State. 30-something people have left the portal as well. It's been a wild week. I know everybody's tired from all the stuff happening. But, of course, Rocco Becht, the biggest name, leaving Iowa State, going to Penn State, he put out an interesting way to say goodbye. And one of the ways that he did that was putting out his graphic saying, whatever, much love. But the caption is what got me and what got many people. It said, forever a Cyclone. Well, last time I checked, the Penn State Nittany Lions are not Cyclones. This reminded me something. The reason we're doing this as a crossover, it reminded me of Will Howard just a few years ago, heading to Ohio State, obviously getting himself over there and winning a national championship. Now Rocco Becht is saying that he feels the resources are perfect in college over at Happy Valley, if you will, and thinks he can win a national championship. What do you take from all this?
Yeah, it's a good question. And a lot of people were talking about it. Is he technically forever a Cyclone? How does that work? I will say the interesting thing about Rocco in comparison to some of these other players is Rocco did graduate from Iowa State. So his degree comes from Iowa State University. And how would you ask, like, if anybody, let's say hypothetically graduated from Iowa State and then went to work somewhere else? I know that doesn't really happen a whole lot, but obviously I'm joking. That happens literally every day. Are those people still loyal, forever, true? Are they still Cyclones through and through? I would say yes. I would think that would be a solid argument. Of course, he's going to play football at a different college, and that adds the interesting wrinkle of when he goes to the NFL, does he say Iowa State or does he say Penn State? If he wins a national title with Penn State, like, how does Iowa State react to that? I understand that it's a confusing situation, but Rocco did graduate from Iowa State. So when it says like loyal, forever, true in there, I didn't take as much of a problem with that because he finished his degree. He completed his schooling at Iowa State, and he just had some extra eligibility, decided to follow his coach. Like, at some point, at the end of the day, with Rocco especially, you have to understand that college football is becoming a business, and you have to make the best move for you. And think about Rocco Becht and, what his NFL kind of radar would have been had he stayed with Jimmy Rodgers and had a down year versus if he goes out with Matt Campbell and has a down year versus an up year. Like, there's so many different ways this can play out. And I think that Rocco made the best move for him, and he finished his degree at Iowa State. And like, for me, that's enough. He put in a lot of time and gave Iowa State a lot of success. Did it end the way I wanted it to? No, of course not. But I can't be upset with him for putting that in there after he wrote that after he graduated. Now, were there some indicators that maybe it wasn't exactly written by a human? Potentially. Okay. And it just is what it is. That's kind of what the world's coming to. But it was written by something after he graduated. I'm okay with him putting that in there.
Yeah, maybe that's the reason why it doesn't feel so bad to me either, because it's the same case with Will Howard. He graduated from Kansas State in 2023. He got a degree in, I believe, accounting, and then moved on and got his he went to Ohio State to finish it. Maybe if you would have just added the fact that he is going to enter the transfer portal as a grad transfer, maybe people would have thought maybe differently of it. Or maybe people would just have blown that off because of the fact that, there's a mass exodus heading out from Iowa State in the portal. And the same thing happening with Kansas State when, players were leaving and him chasing, obviously, a national championship. Maybe if that was just added, maybe people would think differently. What do you think about that?
Maybe. Yeah. And I think part of it too, though, the first thought that I have is, and I am going to say this and just know that when I say this, I feel the same way. Okay. I am not looking from the outside in. It's easy to be frustrated with what Iowa State is going through.
For
Over
sure.
50 players transferring out. You have basically no returning coaches, no returning players. Obviously, it's not none, but it's the biggest 180 shift of a program you can possibly have. I mean, basically, one of the only pillars we have remaining is Kyle Conradi. You could argue like maybe Aiden Flora, but it is going to be a totally different team next season. So on some level, and I don't think to the fault of the fans at all, the fans are going to say, like, I don't really care what you put in there. I'm going to be upset about it. How could you leave Iowa State? Like, we thought you were a Cyclone through and through, and now you're forever a Cyclone, but you're a Nittany Lion. Like, I'm not a fan of that. And I like I said, I have no problem with that thought process because I think the same thing. So whether or not he put that in there, it might have swayed a few people, but I think the vast majority of Cyclone fans, rightly so, are frustrated with the way that this season and this offseason really have gone. How were Kansas State fans with Will Howard transferring over? And I don't think it was so much about the transfer, but about maybe the success that he had there, if my intuition is correct.
Well, it was a different category because, of course, Kansas State was having to make a decision, keep Will Howard or decide to stick with Avery Johnson, right? So, like, there was a different process. It wasn't the fact that a coach was leaving and 70 people were heading in the portal. So I think it's definitely different. But when it comes to the idea of they're going to, dare I say, at least in their mind, greener pastures, as I say in quotations, to try and go win a national championship. And that's something that there was a quote. I mean, there was a big report, a big thing came out by Pete Thamel of ESPN. An ESPN story about Rocco Becht heading at Penn State said, quote, I want to try and win a national championship. Matt Campbell even said that they, quote, we were listening to him talk yesterday, speaking of Rocco Becht, and something about him changed. He's got the resources and the people behind him and the program behind him to do what he wants to do, compete for a national championship. That was Rocco Becht actually talking about Coach Campbell. Of course, he wants to follow his coach. I don't blame him for any reason for him trying to do that. Putting it into a different consideration, though. We talked about it with Rocco Becht to Will Howard. Now with Avery Johnson. Avery Johnson decided to stick around for his final season, 2026. He's going to remain a Kansas State Wildcat. I think we can safely say, I think this is fair assessment, that Rocco Becht or Avery Johnson's not going to go first overall pick in the NFL draft in the next couple of years. They might make it to the league. I think they both could make it, but I don't think either are going to go first overall, right? They're not going to be guaranteed NFL starters. The fact that Avery Johnson has decided to stick at Kansas State solidifies him as a Kansas State legend for the rest of his life, no matter what happens the rest of the way. For him sticking around with Colin Klein, Rocco Becht had the opportunity to do that as well, and he doesn't do that. What does that do for his legacy now? You won a Big 12 championship. You got a double-digit wins for the first time ever in program history, but now you leave with a sour taste in your mouth, and recency bias is always the strongest.
It's a very real thing. I talked about this a little bit because I was kind of in the camp of if he stays, he just kind of, whether it's fair or not, passes Brock Purdy as the GOAT. Like, it doesn't really matter what he does. Fair. Like, he's obviously, and it's unfair to Brock Purdy because he didn't have that opportunity. But like, to stay with the program after all of that change, like, that would be it. Like you put it best, just legendary. And he chose not to do that. So, now you can't hold that against him. I don't think if you're weighing, Brock Purdy versus if you're going to put Seneca Wallace in there versus Rocco Becht, obviously a Big 12 appearance from both Purdy and Rocco. I don't think it hurts him, but it definitely does not help him. That's the biggest thing. And I did want to touch on this really quick. You talk about that quote of competing out at Penn State. I found that to be really interesting because Iowa State was a win away from being in the 12-team playoff. And once you're in the playoffs, guess what? You're 0-0. Like you don't have any wins or losses. It's just playing for your next game. So I did find that to be kind of interesting. Is that really, you didn't have any chances at Iowa State? Because you kind of did. And of course, we know how injured that Iowa State team was. I'm not saying that it was just like some generational choke job or whatever that they lost in that Big 12 championship game. I understand, trust me, I was there in the building. I witnessed the freight train of Cam Scadaboo. It was something special. But to say that there was no chance ever at Iowa State, I don't think it's fair. Once we move to 12 teams, you win that Big 12 championship game against Arizona State, you are now in the 12-team playoff. once you're in the playoff, you have a chance to win it all. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that point. He's kind of just backing his coach. He's moving on to the next thing. We have a chance to win here. I get it. He's saying all of the things. But it is definitely leaving a sour taste in the mouth of Cyclone fans. And so I think if you asked 80% of people in Ames, just up on the street, on campus, hey, who's your GOAT? Unfortunately, I don't think Rocco's going to be in that conversation or he'll be in the conversation, but he's not going to be the pick for a lot of those people.
A lot of Kansas State players that have entered the transfer portal went to what we call, I guess, the Power 2, SEC and Big Ten. They moved up a level, if you want to consider that a case. Of course, we all don't think that at the Big 12, but that's just what some people like to say. Either way, they moved to the Big Ten and they moved to the SEC. There are going to be more players from Iowa State last year playing for Penn State than there is going to be playing for Iowa State this year. So obviously making that jump as well. Does that moving up in development, if you will, is that a testament to Matt Campbell? Or is there a testament to say that we can build and develop here at Iowa State?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it really just comes down to perspective, and that's a personal opinion there. You can make the Matt Campbell argument for sure. I don't know. That's a really good question, man. What do you think?
I think you could say both. I think you could say both, but as somebody who, of course, as seeing it from a different lens than you are right now, don't have the Cyclones colored glasses on, I think you have to lean a little bit towards Matt Campbell and saying what he's doing. Yeah. There's a reason they're following him, right?
Yeah, and to be fair, I was thinking about this, just a few minutes ago, actually live, that like if Rocco would have stayed, it would have like been great for his, legend status and whatever, but he's getting himself into a situation where he doesn't have any idea what the roster looks like. He doesn't have any idea what the coaching staff looks like. So even, if Penn State is arguably, which it's not, a worse situation, you at least are familiar with the coach and from inside the building who else is going over, kind of who you're throwing to. Like, I feel like there is an element of familiarity that you have to give credit to Rocco if you want to talk specifically about him, but about even a bunch of the other players that are transferring over. Just keep that in mind.
How closely are you going to watch those Penn State Cyclones next year?
I said this on air before, so I'm okay with saying it. I might actually watch Wisconsin more than I watch Penn State, like just to watch Abusama, like and some of the other transfers, maybe Michigan State. I'm very curious to see some of those guys who did not go to Penn State. I'll probably see the highlights, and it'll be all over my feed. I am sure of it. So I'm not going to go out of my way to watch Penn State probably next year.
Interesting stuff. Let's get out of here. Enjoy your weekend, everybody, and we'll see you back here on Monday, either on Locked On Cyclones or Locked On Kansas State. You got the Houston Cyclones playing in the playoffs Monday night as well against those Steelers.
Cyclones are becoming a farm, man.